World Cultures and Consciousness, which is really a course in the Yuga cycles, as you'd apply them to understanding world cultures, basically, history, and what's been going on in the world. And so, of course, a term project for students is to take something they're really deeply interested in, some field of study, and examine it from the perspective of the Yuga cycles and its evolution over time, and then write about that. And so out of those assignments has come the two talks we have tonight, but these were done some time ago, and they've been evolved through writing and all the other courses that have given them input. So it's my great pleasure to introduce two speakers. First is Ryan Nikade, who will teach us about, oh no, this is yours. Sorry. Kamran Matlock, as you actually saw in the video, came to us with the teaching potential already, but is learning the education for life system here. And so he's examined education across the Yugas. So let me introduce him.
Thanks. As was mentioned, I have a background in teaching high school, and I have an interesting experience regarding my work in education. In the last 3 years, I've taught at 6 different high schools across California, which is fairly typical of new teachers who are trying to take a stand in the kind of educational climate that has evolved in the United States and in California in particular. So I've seen very bad schools, I've seen very good schools, and I started this project really when I began teaching, and I was looking for something. I was looking for a type of education, I was looking for certain types of students, I was looking for certain types of teaching experiences. And when I started to learn about the Yugas, things just started to click in place. And I knew that I had been participating in something that was way bigger than myself and that was moving me along. And I thought that I was doing it, but really, because I had certain convictions and integrity, that I think education is being sifted and being gradually reorganized. So teachers who find themselves unhappy in certain circumstances are naturally kind of moving towards the fringes, and then the fringes aren't really fringes anymore because so many people are dissatisfied with the way education is being run that alternative education is the new independent mainstream education. And this is a trend I want to talk about, and I think the Yugas helps us find really practical and immediate goals and directions to take when concerning education. So rather than talk to you, I would like to start by telling a couple stories. If my clicker works. So I want to tell you a few different stories from across the Yugas. The first picture on the left is a scene from the Mahabharata, or specifically from the Bhagavad Gita, when Bhishma, who is the king and represents the ego, represents this identity with the self, is fighting against Krishna and Arjuna, who are a student and a teacher, who represent spiritual attainment, spiritual enlightenment, spiritual transcendence. And the story is on the Battle of Kurukshetra. There's a physical, descriptive battle, but the story is rich with allegory and rich with deeper symbolic meaning. And when we talk about education, and especially higher education in Satya and Treta Yuga, a lot of what we have to work with are stories. So the stories that people would be familiar with on an everyday basis and also on a specific basis make up the main part, the substance of education. Excuse me. So deep spiritual allegory in the Mahabharata. On the right we have the Egyptian goddess Ma'at, who represents what in India what would be called dharma, or what we might think of as virtue or right action or nobility. And her ostrich feather that you see there in her band It is said that in Egyptian lore that when you die, your heart, or the actions and deeds of your life, is put on a scale and measured against the feather of Ma'at, the feather of virtue. And this then determines whether you will be reborn, whether you will go to an astral heaven or an astral hell. It's kind of the judgment, their way of judgment. And Ma'at was essential teachings. If you look at the ancient pharaonic teachings of Tao-Tep and a lot of the Egyptian rulers, the sense of dharma or ma'at or virtue is the core principle of their culture and the core principle of their education as well. And now we take a leap to the Greeks. On the top you see Odysseus. That scene is portraying his final encounter with the suitors who were after his wife while he was away on his adventure. But I would actually like to talk about one of my favorite metaphors in all history, in all Yugas. And this is the story of Odysseus and his landing on an island shortly before he returns to the scene we see depicted up here. And it's kind of a side note in the Odyssey, but he lands on this island, and it is said of the island that it is hard to keep fire going. So the inhabitants on this island have a tradition where at night they take the fire from the hearth and they bury it outside and they cover it, and that way in the morning they can dig it up and start it again. And that's all that's really explained, is that fire goes out at night on this place, on this island. And so what Odysseus does is he hears this, he kind of digests this piece of information, and he finds a tree and he leans against the tree and he gathers some fallen boughs and bark and leaves of the tree, and he covers himself. He covers himself up to the neck. And this is the way of Odysseus saying he's covering his own fire. What is his fire? He's covering himself so that in the morning that essence, that fire in his spirit, in his soul, in his self will still be kindled and awake. And Robert Frost actually spoke about this when I first learned about it. He gave a speak at Harvard in the early 20th century about the power of metaphor and how metaphor is really the essence of education. And throughout my experiences in education, I've seen that we've lost this. We've lost the diversity of stories. We've lost the power of stories and the storyteller. And we've lost really meaningful... If you look at the Mahabharata and the Egyptian allegories and these symbolic stories from higher ages, they're powerful. They stimulate our psycho-spiritual centers. They vibrate with us. As you move down, and even in this next pane where you see Hercules battling the Hydra, the stories become more practical. They become less metaphysical, less spiritual. They become more dealing with behavior, more dealing with social situations. The story of the Hydra and Hercules, if you're familiar with the 12 labors of Hercules, Hercules has to fight the Hydra. And the deal with the Hydra is that if you cut off one head, two heads come in its place. And so the way he defeats the Hydra is he cauterizes the heads, and he finds the true head, and he buries it. So he doesn't actually defeat it. And this is representative of certain things, but there's lots of different things that happen when we cut off one head and two grow. Lies work that way. Desires work that way. But again, it doesn't have a really strong central spiritual substance. And that's a huge difference between higher and lower yogic stories in education. And on the left we have the parable of the sower that Jesus tells, where when you're sowing your seeds, when you're planting your seeds, the way the parable goes is that you throw your seeds on the road and they bake and dry in the sun, and they can't grow. You throw them where the birds are, where there's birds, and the birds eat the seeds. They devour the seeds. You throw them in bushes and the thorns and the weeds choke the life out of the seed. And is only on fertile grounds will seeds grow. And this is a rich story in itself. But again, and Jesus' parables are a great example because he has highly specific spiritual parables, and also he has parables that are for everybody. And this is a very important distinction to make when we talk about how lessons either apply to specific spiritual goals or very wide, broad types of practical lessons. And then quickly, the story on the picture on the right is a rabbit from Mayan culture. And in Maya culture, the rabbit is called the mare. And the reason he's called the mare is because the rabbit represents a specific type of Mayan citizen. And the story of the rabbit came about when the Spanish conquistadors came and started to work away at the Mayan culture. And the rabbit represents a Mayan citizen who has compromised his authenticity with Maya culture and has somehow made deals with the Spaniards and has kind of sacrificed his authenticity of his culture. And the story goes briefly that Rabbit and Crab, who represents he's the good guy, Crab, they decide they're going to plant some carrots. And so they're working harmoniously together, they're cooperating, they're planting carrots. The carrots grow, they begin to harvest the carrots, and Rabbit's pulling the carrots up, and Crab is chopping off the ends, and they're making nice, neat piles, and they're being civil. And then at one point, Rabbit decides that he probably deserves more carrots than Crab does. And he noticed that there's two piles. And the one pile that's bigger is the heads of the carrots, the ends of the carrots. And the other pile that's smaller are the actual carrots. And he says, you know, Crab, because I'm such a good guy, I'm going to give you the bigger pile. I'm going to give you the ends of the carrots. And Crab says, no, this isn't fair. This wouldn't be fair for either of us. And Rabbit thinks for a moment. He says, well, I know. Why don't we have a race? And whoever wins the race gets to choose which pile they want. And so Crab says, okay, I suppose this is fair. And Crab kind of has a little glint in his eye, too, because he's scheming something up. And Crab and Rabbit take about 30 paces away, and Rabbit gets ready, and he's so sure of himself, he knows he's way faster than a crab. And he says, I'll tell you what, if you win this, I'll give you all the carrots. You can have everything. I'll just walk away. And Crab says, okay, that's fine. So Rabbit gets ready, and he looks at Crab, and he just kind of laughs to himself. He knows he's going to win. And he says, 1, 2, 3. And Crab pinches the back of Rabbit, pinches Rabbit's tail kind of quietly. And Rabbit takes off. Go. He reaches the carrots in a couple seconds. He spins around, and he looks ready to gloat at Crab. And he says, where's Crab? Crab, where are you? Crab says, I'm here on the pile. And Crab releases from his tail. And he's sitting on the pile. Now, this is a great story. It has lots of social commentary in it. It has all types of philosophical and behavioral lessons encoded in it. But it's not essentially spiritual. And if you want to I didn't include this, but if you want to look at the kinds of movies and television that kids watch, which is really, if you talk about modern education, you can talk about the institution of the school, but I think the institution of media, of television and movies is really how kids are being educated today, because that's where the stories are. They don't get stories in school. If they do get stories in school, they're watered down, they're convoluted, the art of storytelling has been lost. The most powerful stories are in the movies, when you go and you have surround sound that's blasting you from all angles, and you have a giant screen, and it's just, you soak up the consciousness of the movie, and it fills your senses. That's where kids are being educated. That's where the tradition of stories are still working and are still alive. It's a major problem that will have to be dealt with, and education has to consider. So moving on to some practical things. Throughout the Yugas, the evolution of educational need is kind of my focus. How does the need of the students change over time? And obviously our stories have changed. That was what I just kind of illustrated. How have our stories changed? Why have our stories changed? And how can we revive the types of stories that are inspiring and move kids in the right directions? That's the kind of, these are the kinds of things we want to focus on. And then again, the divergence of worldly skills and spiritual skills. So while in the higher Yugas we have very focused spiritual lessons, very focused spiritual and rich lessons and experiential lessons, as things change, we become out of need, and it becomes appropriate. We need practical lessons. We need practical skills. Things that are so harmonious in the higher ages, we don't even have to worry about. By the time we come to the pits of Kali Yuga, and even today, they become the substance of our lives. We need to make money. We need a house. We need very basic needs. And these are the consequences of advanced states of social development. And advanced states of social development is a nice way of saying civilization. So what happens when you have 7 billion people, which happened in 2011, living on Earth, and you have to make sure all the children of 7 billion people get some sort of education? It's a human experiment on scales we've never even considered before. And considering that 1 billion people existed on Earth probably for the first time in the 1800s, and it's exponentially increasing, we have a very unusual and unprecedented problem with figuring out what is education going to do? Are we going to try to teach everybody all the time? Are we going to try to focus on teaching leaders? We have some very practical and some very serious questions to consider. So I like to think of education in Dwapara ascending, where we are now, as our Renaissance period. What we're doing right now is looking back in order that we can look forward with some specific directions, some specific goals. It doesn't matter how good our education is today. We don't know what we're preparing our students for. What does it mean to be successful in the next 10 years, 20 years, 100 years? Things are changing so rapidly. What are we preparing people for? Does a diploma equal a degree? Does a diploma equal a career or a job or anything, really? What types of experiences and lessons are we giving our students so that they will be able to succeed? And we don't even know. And we pretend like we do. So I'm going to read briefly to you. This is from Charles Dickens's Hard Times, which you may be familiar with. There's a character in it named Gradgrind. And if you can tell by his name, he likes facts. He likes the worldly plane. That's kind of his idea of education. And this is Gradgrind's wife and is speaking to Gradgrind's daughter. And Louisa, Gradgrind's daughter, kind of gets the blunt end of Gradgrind's philosophy. And one of the things I think is difficult in education, in mainstream education, to accept about alternative and consciousness-based models is that they're hard to assess. Mainstream education prefers standardized assessment. It's kind of blanket assessment. And we could talk about whether that even works, but they kind of roll their eyes when you talk about how we're going to assess consciousness or spiritual growth, things like this. Well, I think Dickens had a great example of ways we can tell when people don't get spiritual or soulful education. So Gradgrind's wife says to Louisa, "You learned a great deal, Louisa, and so did your brother. Ologies of all kind from morning to night. If there is any ology left, of any description, that has not been worn to rags in this house, all I can say is, I hope I shall never hear its name. But there is something, not an ology at all, that your father has missed or forgotten, Louisa. I don't know what it is. I have often thought about it. I shall never get its name now." So what is this missing component? And this is probably one of the most meaningful, and I was an English literature student, so I'll say that I get more excited than the average person about literature. But this is one of the most poignant moments in literature that I encountered. And this is Louisa finally coming to her father and telling her what his philosophy of empirical, rational, fact-based education has done to her. She says, "Father, you have trained me from my cradle. I curse the hour in which I was born to such a destiny. How could you give me life and take from me all the inappreciable things that raise it from the state of conscious death? Where are the graces of my soul? Where are the sentiments of my heart? What have you done, O Father? What have you done with the garden that should have bloomed once in this great wilderness here? I don't reproach you, Father. What you have never nurtured in me, you have never nurtured in yourself. But oh, if you had only done so long ago, or if you had only neglected me, what a much better, much happier creature I should have been this day." Wow. And there's a saying in Waldorf education that, and we have it here in our schools as well, that around 12 years old you start to see a change, a major shift in children, and something that can be noticeably seen in the eyes. And I've seen it in public education from the other way around, that their light goes out, their curiosity goes out. They lose that, we could say innocence, but I think it's more. I think it's something more pure, and it becomes tainted and it becomes eroded and destroyed in public education, where they're not given the kind of holistic nurturing that is needed. And this is a personal statement to me here, because I've seen so many students who have good hearts and who have high potential, but there's just no way they're going to get, their education is harming them. Neglect would be better. Okay, on to some prescriptions. Trends in higher Yuga education. Education is psycho-spiritually active. I like the word psycho-spiritual. It means that you're growing psychologically and you're attuned spiritually. It's a really dynamic combination. And education in the higher Yugas focuses on self-mastery and what we might call self-realization or individuation or merging with our cosmic ground of being, however you want to say it. They're being prepared for that experience. And this has to do with a very intimate, sacred student-teacher relationship, something that is impossible in the modern way of educating kids. My first experience student teaching, I had 40 children in my class, and I had 5 classes. That's 200 students. It took me a month to learn all their names. how are you going to teach deep truths on that level? No wonder 50% of all new teachers drop out. And not to mention the health problems that they have, stress problems. So the lessons are transrational, allegorical, and they use the symbolic domain. This is one of the most powerful things. I had to learn to cope when I was teaching in public school. I had to learn how to be a storyteller, and I had to learn quick. How do you engage 40 students who have their heads full of television, movies, video games? They have a 5-minute attention span. They have just come back from a recess or a lunch loaded with sugar and carbs. They have dysfunctional home lives. They don't get enough sleep. They are some of the worst cases. If I were to imagine the best and worst students I could have, for a few years, all I got were I was being prepared for something, I believe now, but it was intense. And I learned how to be a storyteller. When you tell a story, it doesn't matter where your student comes from. Everybody instantly drops wherever they came from, and they enter into the moment. Their senses become engaged. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. The presence of a storyteller commands attention. And the lessons that are embedded in the story explode with meaning. They're rich. They're dynamic. They seep into the deeper parts of your being so that later you start thinking about things you never even realized you heard. The moments in a story become precious, and we keep them close to us throughout our lives. This is wonderful. But we're not there yet. So passive or indirect psychospiritual education is kind of where we're at right now. And I truly believe that education is always spiritual and is always psychologically growthful to a degree. And when we think it's absent, it's usually just passive or indirect. And I often think of mainstream education. Are you guys familiar with the Greek myth of Atlas? He's the Titan who holds the world upon his shoulders. I think of mainstream education as there's a handful of really strong, stalwart educators holding the weight of academia upon their shoulders, and without them it would crumble, it would fall. They're the ones who are giving them just a little bit, just enough for students to keep going. And one of the big problems today, and I'll talk about this in a second, is redefining what it means to be a teacher. So the teacher-student relationship is specialized today. It's a profession. It's a job. And many teachers are attracted to this job because you get summers off. And especially in the West, in America, people think, oh, being a teacher is easy. It's like being a babysitter or, in America especially is one of the cultures that least values teachers. And it gets very complicated when we bring in teacher unions and political precedents. And we could talk about A Nation at Risk, the infamous report in the 80s, and No Child Left Behind Act, and Obama's Race to the Top initiative. Education is national competition in America, and teachers and students fall by the wayside. And again, the lessons are literal and describe instead of providing experience. So this is what you probably grew up with. This is kind of the bread and butter of our modern institution. So redefining what it means to be a teacher. And of all my research with the Yugas, this is kind of the heart of it. And this is what I take most personally, looking at what does it mean to be a teacher in Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, and then Kali Yuga. And can we create a spectrum or a directional model so that we can train new teachers that they can then be agents for this Dwapara change we're trying to experience. So what does it look like to be a teacher in Satya Yuga? These are archetypes, by the way, developed by Carl Jung, and they're eerily applicable to the Yugas. And if you're familiar with Jung's work with archetypes, he didn't know about the Yugas, but he had some descriptions of time, consciousness, and culture that pretty much describe he was tuned into the way they work. So he says that all teaching is spiritual, but at the highest level, the teacher is the archetype of the priest, or incarnational spirituality. The teacher is a channel. So the teacher has a deep attunement to some sort of spiritual truth, and the student, in the presence of that teacher, receives direct experience with whatever he or she is attuned to. And this fits the Satya Yuga need of self-realization or individualization. This is the primary goal. By the time we drop to Treta Yuga, we have what we call the archetype of the Zen master are ontological spirituality, so consciousness-based spirituality. This is what we're probably most familiar with today if you're on some sort of spiritual path, or if you've been to a therapist, or if you've had an exceptional teacher. They work with your consciousness. And the picture here is of Dakshinamurti, who the great Saint Ramakrishna referred to as one of the foremost experts in teaching by Mauna, or teaching by silence. So in the presence of this type of teacher, the sheer presence, the sheer will of this teacher. I used to pretend like I could operate at this level. I would walk into my class and I'd stand like this, quietly, and there'd be roaring, and it'd be, this is where teachers lose their voice when they're telling everyone to be quiet. And I'd sit there and I'd try to just put my presence out there. And I had trouble with it at first, but then I was also training dogs on the side when I was first teaching. And I learned how to do it working with animals, because animals are very sensitive to your presence. And I can, even with a class full of 40 students, I can stand up and make them be quiet just by being quiet. You make eye contact, and you feel your way around the class. So this type of teacher really is trying to teach students. The learning objective is self-mastery versus individuation or self-realization. In order to be self-realized, you first must master your senses. It's also the place where renunciation happens, where desires and fears are transcended. This teacher is kind of the nitty-gritty of the spiritual path. And in Satya Yuga, everything's great. Rishis are teachers, rishis are students. People are getting enlightened every day. It's great. Treta Yuga, even though it's very high, we have cultures from Treta Yuga who, like the ancient Sumerians, whose culture extends back into Treta Yuga, and we have tablets of the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic. There's students who got caned by their teachers in Treta Yuga, at least in 4000 BCE, but it's not a cut and dry type of system. And what we're most familiar with today is the archetype of the national prophet, or civic spirituality. So with the advent of civilization, with things like imperialism, global conquest, we have a very complex, populated society and culture, and these teachers step in and spirituality takes a new form. So the learning objective of these teachers is self-empowerment, and to help either an individual, an entire society, or culture fulfill their highest potential. It's a call to their either forgotten or lost ideals. This teacher serves, in India, they talk about the Jupiter and the Venus guru. The one guru is very spiritually focused. The other guru will teach you how to be good at your job, will teach you how to be good with your relationships, will teach you how to be good in all aspects of your life. And this is the type of teacher that is most appropriate for our age. And this is the type of teacher we want in our age, that will catapult us, that will act as a catalyst, and will change schools most rapidly. Then the lowest age, which we're actually also very familiar with, is the teacher as philosopher, or scholastic spirituality. And we can think of the great philosophers, we can think of martial discipline, we can think of academia. This is where spirituality is usually conceived of only on the intellectual level, or not at all. It's kind of a subconscious, very fragile, kind of weak force. And the goal here is to teach people merely to rely on themselves, to be independent, that they have the potential to take steps up the ladder. It's the beginning point. And there's even a lower point below it that's complete passivity, where if you see in the depths of Kali Yuga, people didn't even have an interest in improving their lives or moving beyond their box. And so this is kind of the starting point, which the learning objective is really law and order. So getting students to stop talking, getting them to follow the rules. And what is most important about this system, and which is still taking me a long time to digest, is that it represents one whole. If you want to be a good teacher today and you walk into a classroom, you'll need a little bit from each category. Maybe since we're in Dwapara Yuga, more of the civic spirituality will be more relevant and more effective. But each step is important. There will be a certain amount of law and order. There will be a certain amount of civic spirituality. You're working with consciousness. The teacher is a kind of therapist often. And you need to have spiritual attunement. You need spiritual attunement and ontological spirituality. You need magnetism, like Dakshinamurti, and you need to rely a little bit from each category. So this is my last slide. And under the Yuga framework, education is never broken or fixed. This is the most stress-relieving revelation from the Yugas, is that even by making the effort to learn the Yugas and to go out there and spread its message, we are agents of change that if it wasn't us, it would be somebody else. These things happen whether we like it or not. Now we can consciously participate in it, we can make it happen more quickly and more effectively, and we can grow through it. These are the goals that the Yugas empowers us to make. So responding appropriately to mainstream education. We don't have to grind our teeth and become frightened by the news or participate in a lot of the other types of scare tactics that our nation's education is failing. The Eastern education models are we're losing jobs, and education has become very warped, politicized, and it's become driven by the institution and by the government. And these are Kali Yuga forces that have their purpose and still have their purpose in society, but their purpose is lessening. And like I said, as the mainstream educations kind of crumble, the fringe, the alternative educations will become the new independent, the new model. And one of the most important goals for alternative education and the evolving holistic models that kind of represent the cusp of alternative education is directional goals. Again, there was a study done in the 70s where over 100 acceptable, proven, valid teaching approaches were out and being practiced. Psychologists, schools, different institutions, over 100 different teaching models, but no one asked why. Why do we teach in the first place? We know how to teach, but why do we teach? We need directional goals. Teacher training programs, these last 2 points, teacher training programs are the key, I believe, because teachers, when we look at them not as a profession, but as the storyteller, as the shaman, as the priest, as members of society that are record keepers for deep spiritual truths, and they emanate deep spiritual truths. We need to start to value them as more than a specialized field. And then lastly, the participation of community and parents is crucial. As we look towards alternative schools blooming and expanding, they need the support of community and parents. Teachers can't do it alone. Teachers are the key, and communities and parents are the fuel that will allow that change to happen. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to share with you some of my research on archetypes and the Yuga ages. So let's begin. So first, I would like to define what an archetype is. Thankfully, Kamran touched on archetypes a little bit ago. Archetypes, as brought forth by Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, are defined as universal patterns that are pervasive and ubiquitous throughout history and different cultures. You can think of them as like universal roles. So if you watch a Disney movie or a Star Wars, for example, we have the hero, the villain, we have the princess or the female character, the wise old man. So these are all universal examples of the same character role that usually are relevant and have the same meaning for everyone. And that's something that we haven't necessarily learned, but it's deeper than cultural programming, deeper than left brain linear intelligence. They touch us on a very deep intuitive level of meaning and character and kind of the different roles that we can partake in life. So why I think it's important to study archetypes in relation to Yuga ages is if you think of each Yuga age as emitting a certain kind of frequency, archetypes are then crystallized by this frequency. So each frequency will mold into different archetypal forms. So if you study the archetypes and see their deeper symbology, see what these archetypes represent, see what they mean, and assess their consciousness level, we can then gain insight into the age from which they originated from. And you can think of archetypes as really embodying the characteristics of each Yuga age. So in my project, I've compared the archetypes from the Treta Yuga, or the third highest age right below Satya Yuga. And the archetypal caste I've used to represent the Treta Yuga is the archetypes from the Rig Veda. And this is because the Rig Veda, which is the most ancient Vedic scripture containing hymns to various deities, is probably, I think, the oldest book and writing in Sanskrit, oldest in the world. And it was composed from 6,000, scholars say between 6,000 to 8,000 BC, which is the time of the Treta Yuga. So the Treta Yuga is the age of the mind, of mental mastery, of higher perception and intuitive knowledge. It is the age when time is annihilated and we can have a larger comprehension of the metaphysical underworking of reality. And so the archetypes that emerge from this age will thus reflect those symbolically. So this is what they are. The archetypes of the Rig Veda are basically aspects of superconsciousness. It's kind of understood that there's the subconscious level, the subconscious realm, the realm that's normally worked with in dreams, fantasies, and in psychoanalysis. Then there's the conscious mind, the mind, the realm of logical rationality, decision-making, these kind of faculties that exist during our waking life, and the superconscious realm. The superconscious realm is the realm of mystical experiences, transpersonal psychology. It's the realm of higher chakras, samadhi. So in meditation, we want to try to access the superconscious realm. So these archetypes from the Treta Yuga and from the Rig Veda, you can think of as crystallizations or personifications of the superconscious realm. They are different mystical experiences, or as David Frawley, the well-known yogic scholar, calls the divine laws of truth, and they're encapsulated into a kind of character form. This is definitely something that can only really occur in the higher ages, excuse me, because this was a lot easier to do. The consciousness frequency was a lot lighter, people were higher consciousness, and the rishis, who are the people who composed the sages or seers that composed the Vedas and the Rig Veda, were able to superconsciously perceive these archetypes and then were able to record them in the Vedas. And also these different archetypes symbolize inner yogic alchemy, which I'll explain in a second. So the four main god characters of the Rig Veda are Surya, who's the Vedic sun god. And symbolically, Surya represents divine wisdom and the emergence of order out of chaos. So he's the coherency of the universe, the law of organization and order and coherency of consciousness that emerged out of primeval chaos and randomness. And I'll touch more on Surya later. Agni is the god of fire. On the physical level, he can relate to the fire like a physical fire or the fire in our digestion. But on a deeper level, Agni relates to the fire of consciousness, the fire of awareness, the flame of the soul's awareness. Then we have Soma, who's the nectar of bliss and immortality. And a lot of scholars or archaeologists confuse Soma and think that it could be some kind of psychedelic plant or hallucinogen that causes some kind of mystical experience. And that's one way of interpreting it, but on a physical level. On a energetic or yogic level, Soma is the ambrosia or the amrit, the nectar of immortality, and is said to bestow bliss and such. And finally, Indra is the cosmic man. He's also, you can think of as man made in God's image. He symbolizes the higher self or the Purusha, which is the eternal witness consciousness that one who is realized comes to know. And Indra, Agni, and Soma kind of represent the threefold process of inner alchemical transformation. Agni is the fire which burns upward. It's our flame of devotion, spiritual aspiration, upward moving consciousness that burns from the solar plexus. But if you only have Agni burning, you're going to burn out your nervous system. The fire, the masculine yang energy has to be counterbalanced by something else, and that's Soma. Soma develops the crown chakra and drips down. Its watery yin, feminine energy will come to meet with Agni and unite in the heart, which is where Indra is realized, the cosmic self, the eternal witness, and then you are enlightened. It's pretty awesome. On the other hand, we have the archetypes of the Kali Yuga. And the Greek myths and archetypes reflect the consciousness of the Kali Yuga, which includes increased materiality, rigidity, contraction of consciousness, denser consciousness, more physical, more sensory. You can think of it as like a lower chakra. And they also reflect a loss of attunement and direct perception of knowledge. So they had to acquire knowledge in different ways because the direct perception was lost, which I'll touch on in a moment. The Greek myths and stories of the gods and heroes reflect an imbalance in the masculine and feminine, and so it really reflects kind of a patriarchal dominance and bias. And also, a lot of the stories are just very sad and very bitter, and they reflect how life was very difficult and hard in the Kali Yuga. How these archetypes from the Greek mythology originated, where they emerged as projections from the subconscious. So unlike the Vedic archetypes, they were not perceived in superconscious, they were projected out of the subconscious, and thus the gods and myths are filled with human flaws and every single kind of psychological problem you can ever think about. All of the myths symbolically depict the ego, which is represented by the hero, encounter with the unconscious forces, the untamed, very first three chakra, lower consciousness responses. And it's a very, very hectic and very scary journey to try to fight off all these lower conscious forces, which is all the myths are really about. And this is why Jung related most of the Greek myths to mental illness. The consciousness of these myths was most relevant to people who were suffering at this particular level of consciousness. And so I'll also touch on that in a moment. So if we look at a few examples of gods and heroes from the Greek mythology, first we have Heracles and the lion, or actually the myth of Heracles, or the Roman Hercules in general, was that Hercules had to fight off all of these monsters, and during his task called the 12 labors of Heracles. And in this, Hercules is the ego, and all of the monsters represent some lower aspect of consciousness or lower aspect of personality, that Hercules is trying not to become consumed by. So things like rage, lust. The myth of the Hydra, which Kamran touched on, is that he never really defeated the Hydra, he just repressed it under a rock, which I'll come back to in a moment. So really the ego's battle versus lower consciousness forces. Zeus, the king of the Olympians, is the god of power, authority, law, and punishment. He's an example of what happens, the tendencies that a male figure can have when they're put into a position of power. So when the ego is put into a position of power, how does it manifest? Well, it manifests as Zeus, as he kind of abused his power. He had affairs with tons of women and nymphs and mythological creatures, and it really went kind of sour. And he also represents law and punishment. And so that very strict rigidity of the Kali Yuga, if you don't follow the rules, you're going to get fried by Zeus's thunderbolt, kind of a thing. And Athena is kind of the Greeks' favorite goddess. She's a very well-esteemed goddess amongst the Greek people. And she represents knowledge, culture, and rationality, and civilization, and creativity. Unfortunately, the thing is that while she is a very positive goddess, all of her attributes are male attributes. Look at, she carries a shield and a spear and has a helmet and armor, because it's basically, that's what kind of females were valued in a male-dominated world. Hades is the underworld, the subconscious. I don't know how many have seen the Disney movie Hercules, but Hades is the main bad guy ruling the really lower subconscious realms, kind of like just so subconscious in general and just lower aspects of consciousness. So this is something to juxtapose also between the Treta Yuga and the Kali Yuga, is rationality versus the divine wisdom. In the Treta Yuga, knowledge and information was obtained by direct perception, where people in deep states of meditation could kind of perceive the metaphysical underworkings of reality, and thus developed the Vedic sciences. And Surya, who's the Vedic sun god, he symbolizes this divine wisdom and the direct attainment of knowledge by intuition, by higher seeing, by activating the third eye and perceiving into reality. On the other hand, in the Greeks, in the Kali Yuga, because these higher faculties of intuition and perception were lost, they had to depend on rationality, reason, and the senses to acquire knowledge. And this is personified by Apollo. Apollo amongst the gods, he's the Greek sun god, and he's also the god of art, creativity, science, and rationality. He's a very highly esteemed god in Greek mythology. He's Greek's golden boy, literally. And he represents the pinnacle, the high points of Greek civilization. And while that was a very wonderful thing for Greeks and had a very positive impact on history, Greeks' great contribution to sciences, to math and reason, and Aristotle using the senses to obtain information. Very positive contribution, but it was still a fall from the higher ages. Now we look at the ideal of the female archetype through the Yugas. In the Treta Yuga, the goddess was the highest manifestation or expression of yin or feminine energy, completely transcending gender altogether. It's not even related to the realm of bodily consciousness or gender identification. It's just a universal and cosmic feminine principles at its highest, including things such as the divine word, the creative force that creates all of existence, and this form in the universe in general is a manifestation of the goddess sacrificing herself into material existence. So it's the highest level of consciousness relating to feminine energy. As David Frawley says, the goddess has nothing to do with social, political, or cultural phenomena, but with universal forces and inner yogic alchemy. So the main example is Saraswati, who is the goddess of the divine word and higher things like higher sound vibrations or language in general. However, in the Kali Yuga, as Joseph Campbell, the very well-known mythologist, points out, all of the goddesses originated as projections from the subconscious, from a male-dominated culture, and thus reflect the biases of a patriarchal culture. The goddesses represent the ideal woman in a masculine world. So the three goddesses in Greek mythology, such as Athena, which is the ideal of man projected onto women, with her armor and intelligence. Hera, who is the ideal wife, and Aphrodite, the ideal woman who will provide pleasure and beauty and beautiful things for the man. And Jane Shinoda Bolen, who's a well-known Jungian analyst, he wrote a book called Goddesses in Every Woman, which is about how we can look at the goddesses and goddesses of Greek mythology as different personality types. She says that she calls Hera, Demeter, and Persephone the vulnerable goddesses, or goddesses who were victimized, abused, degraded, abducted, raped. All kind of nasty things happened to them in these lower ages. And it's really unfortunate because it's a reflection of what the mass consciousness was like in Kali Yuga, where women were viewed this way, women were treated this way. And on a side note, of course, this still happens in our modern day society, but since the 1800s kind of women's revolution, which also correlates with the onset of the Power Yuga, this has been a lot better. And this is the next thing I'll touch on is, in almost all of the Greek myths, where the hero was journeying and fighting off all these monsters, at the end of the story, unlike in Disney movies, there's some kind of a dissociation between him and the female character. It doesn't work out. The ego is unable to integrate or bond, unite with the feminine principle. And I'll show you some stories. In the myth of Jason and Medea, or the Golden Fleece, Jason leaves Medea, who was kind of his companion, his female companion, all throughout the story. It's supposed to end happily ever after, no. He leaves her for the princess of Thebes. Medea kills the princess, Jason's wife, and their children together, and then ascends to the sky on a chariot. So instead of getting married or whatever, she just kills people. In the myths of Theseus and the Minotaur, and his prime companion Adriane, who actually helps him navigate the labyrinth where the Minotaur is, he promises Adriane that he will marry her. Well, what happens is that Theseus breaks a promise to marry her, and he abandons her on an island, and then he leaves. In the myths of Heracles and Deianira, Heracles falls in love with another woman, and Deianira was given a love potion and said that if Heracles falls in love with another woman, give him the love potion to win him back. He was actually tricked. The love potion was the poison from the buried Hydra. Remember the Hydra repressed under the rock? If you repress something, it will come back to kill you, and it killed Heracles. Kali Yuga. Now, the next aspects of the Yugas are enlightenment and individuation, the goal of the spiritual journey. In the Treta Yuga, all of the Vedic gods and what they symbolize are different aspects of enlightenment or spiritual realization. In the Vedic view of the mind, the three highest levels of consciousness are called Sat, Chit, Ananda, which are being, consciousness, and bliss. Indra represents being, Agni, or fire, represents the eternal flame of consciousness, and Soma represents bliss. And Surya, the sun god, represents the buddhi, or our deeper or existential intelligence, which discriminates between truth and falsehood. So these four main Vedic gods symbolize the four highest aspects of mind and consciousness. The stories, the mythological stories contained in the hymns of the Rig Veda, outline the road to spiritual realization. So the journey of the hero, which is Indra, he's the yogi hero, and when he slays the dragon of egoism and attains enlightenment, for example, in one of the hymns it said that he releases the 7 rivers, which symbolize opening of the 7 chakras. And in another story, when he fights the dragon, Indra drinks Soma and becomes very powerful and big to fight the dragon. So the yogi encounters bliss and gives him the strength to overcome the ego. So it's basically how to spiritually transcend things that are blocking enlightenment. And because in the Treta Yuga, enlightenment was the primary goal. I think a lot of people saw it. A lot of people could relate to these myths. A lot of people could use the myths in the Rig Veda as a practical roadmap towards spiritual realization. However, in the Greek myths, this is where Joseph Campbell primarily coined the term the hero's journey. In the Kali Yuga. Now, the myths symbolize a masculine ego's journey towards individuation. So what is the difference between individuation and enlightenment? As Jung said, individuation is primarily personality integration. It's about coming to terms with different aspects of yourself and assimilating them and growing from them, but on a more psychological level. We're still working on the level of the personality, refining the personality, expanding your character, but not completely transcending the personality. So the enemies and monsters in the Greek myths all symbolize primitive aspects of the unconscious psyche, which I mentioned, which the hero has to try to overcome and assimilate. The stories all end in tragedy or bitterness. In other words, they have a failed integration. Now here's what something really interesting was. I read that in the book. I said, is that really true? All the stories end in tragedy or bitterness and failed integration? So I researched it, and I found that all of them ended except for one, which was what Kamran talked about, the story of Odysseus. And he finally, on his long journey, reunites with Penelope, his wife, after killing the suitors. He reunites with Penelope, and they kind of have a nice union. So he did complete individuation, but that story came from the Dwapara Yuga. So it doesn't really count. And if you look at the Eightfold Path of Raja Yoga, there is Yama and Niyama, which are the foundation of Raja Yoga, which is basically the ethical principles. The Yamas being the don'ts, such as lying and stealing. And the niyamas are things that you should try to promote or do, like cleanliness and inner contentment and such. So in all the Greek myths in the Kali Yuga, you can think of as working on a yama level of consciousness, is the fundamental, do not do all these things. Do not lie, do not steal, do not lust. And people, all the heroes will try to overcome the monsters which symbolize those things. For example, Heracles, again, out of rage, he killed his music teacher when he was really mad. He killed his family, and he lusted and had all these. Yes, thank you. Lots of consorts, and all representing things like lust and anger and violence and such like that. So now I want to touch on some key figures in our Age of Ascending Dwapara Yuga. And David Frawley and Sri Aurobindo are the two people's interpretation of the Vedas that I studied for this project. And in Dwapara Ascending, what Frawley and Aurobindo have done is they've revived the original and spiritual interpretation of the Vedas. Prior to them, a lot of scholars had interpreted the Vedas and in a way where it made, without a spiritual understanding, So it made the information look like the ancient Vedic people were very primitive people. So Front Arban said, no, this is deep spiritual truths here, and they, with their interpretations and books on the Vedas, they really revived that for the general populace. As willpower advances, the Vedas will become increasingly relevant, because as our consciousness of the age goes back up, they'll start to parallel the consciousness from which the Vedas originated. So what could have been very misunderstood can now become more a part of our lives, both symbolically and vibrationally. More people will be able to use this knowledge. And what Aurobindo and Frawley have done is they've mainstreamed yogic techniques and sadhanas, such as pranayamas and mantras, so people can realize things directly in meditation and hopefully in samadhi. So we're moving back up to try to...
Could you flip that? I just wanted to write down their names.
Oh, sure.
Follow up on that. Thank you.
So the other two key players are Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, and they've really revived soul in the modern world. What does that mean? Well, first, both of them, they illuminated the deeper meanings and symbolism in mythology. So mythology is not random fantastic stories that didn't exist or used to scare children, but mythology is also revealing deep spiritual truths as well. And it's relevant to everyday life. Carl Jung asked himself, what myth am I living? What archetypal patterns am I living and acting out to bring greater self-awareness into my life? Both of them, through their understanding of archetypes and symbolism, really united all cultures and traditions around the world, because we looked beneath the surface of outward appearances into the depth, into the soul, into the meaning of these symbols and images, and said that they're universally shared by everyone. What psychoanalysis tries to do is it brings the hidden remnants of Kali Yuga out of the unconscious psyche and into Dvapara Yuga. So you can think about the remnants of Kali Yuga are still partially lodged in the collective unconsciousness, the collective consciousness of humanity that we're not really conscious of. And these can cause a lot of problems when we're not consciously in touch with these aspects, with these darker forces. And so what psychoanalysis tries to do is bring them into the light. For example, the bully. We all experience problems with bullies at school. But there is an archetypal transformation that can happen. The bully turns into the hero. The hero turns into the warrior. And the warrior turns into Arjuna. So there is a symbolic and archetypal transformation that will continue to go up the yugas as well. And also what these two have done is they've revived soul or consciousness in all these academic fields, including psychology, anthropology, literature, history, anything that can, where it's made these academic fields looking at the inward aspects of them as well, the aspects that deal with consciousness, the aspects that deal with symbolism and metaphor, which, as Kamran alluded to earlier, which is a prime characteristic of higher Yuga education. So you can think that Jung and Campbell are healing the consciousness out of Kali Yuga, bringing the remnants of the unconscious into Dvapara for transformation, while Frawley and Aurobindo, with their techniques, their sadhana guidelines, are helping us to accelerate our consciousness into the future. Thank you very much.